Hey guys, Lord Naren White here, the Holy Ghost, the one true God, back with you with the next video in my series. Reading Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens. Without further ado, returning to Oliver Twist as read by Lord Naren White. She was my daughter, said the old woman, nodding her head in the direction of the corpse, and speaking with an idiotic leer, more ghastly than even the presence of death in such a place. Lord, Lord! Well, it is strange that I who gave birth to her and was a woman then should be alive and merry now. And she lying there, so cold and stiff. Lord, Lord, to think of it! It's as good as a play, as good as a play. As the wretched creature mumbled and chuckled in her hideous merriment, the undertaker turned to go away. Stop, stop, said the old woman in a loud whisper. Will she be buried tomorrow? Or next day, or tonight? I laid her out, and I must walk, you know. Send me a large cloak, a good warm one, for it is bitter cold. We should have cake and wine, too, before we go. Never mind. Send some bread. Only a loaf of bread and a cup of water. Shall we have some bread, dear? She said eagerly, catching at the undertaker's coat as he once more moved towards the door. Mr. Bumble, I believe. Yes, yes, said the undertaker. Of course. Anything you'd like. He disengaged himself from the old woman's grasp and, drawing Oliver after him, hurried away. The next day, the family having been meanwhile relieved with a half-quartern loaf and a piece of cheese, left with them by Mr. Bumble himself, Oliver and his master returned to the miserable abode, where Mr. Bumble had already arrived, accompanied by 4 men from the workhouse who were to act as bearers. An old black cloak had been thrown over the rags of the old woman and the man, and the bare coffin, having been screwed down, was hoisted on the shoulders of the bearers and carried out into the street. Now you must put your best leg foremost, old lady, whispered Sowerberry in the old woman's ear. We are rather late, and it won't do to keep the clergyman waiting. Move on, my men, as quick as you like. Thus directed, the bearers trotted on under their light burden, and the 2 mourners kept as near them as they could. Mr. Bumble and Sowerberry walked at a good smart pace in front, and Oliver, whose legs were not so long as his master's, ran by the side. There was not so great a necessity for hurrying as Mr. Sowerberry had anticipated. However, for when they reached the obscure corner of the churchyard in which the nettles grew, and where the parish graves were made, the clergyman had not arrived, and the clerk, who was sitting by the vestry-room fire, seemed to think it by no means improbable that it might be an hour or so before he came. So they put the bier on the brink of the grave, and the 2 mourners waited patiently in the damp clay, with the cold rain drizzling down, while the ragged boys whom the spectacle had attracted into their churchyard played a noisy game at hide-and-seek among the tombstones, or varied their amusements by jumping backwards and forwards over the coffin. Mr. Sowerberry and Bumble, being personal friends of the clerk, sat by the fire with him, and read the paper. At length, after a lapse of something more than an hour, Mr. Bumble and Sowerberry and the clerk were seen running towards the grave. Immediately afterwards, the clergyman appeared, putting on his surplice as he came along. Mr. Bumble then thrashed a boy or 2 to keep up appearances, and the reverend gentleman, having read as much of the burial service as could be compressed into 4 minutes, gave his surplice to the clerk and walked away again. Now, Bill, said Sowerberry to the gravedigger, fill up. It was no very difficult task, for the grave was so full that the uppermost coffin was within a few feet of the surface. The grave digger shoveled in the earth, stamped it loosely down with his feet, shouldered his spade, and walked off, followed by the boys, who murmured very loud complaints at the fun being over so soon. "Come, my good fellow," said Bumble, tapping the man on the back. "They want to shut up the yard?" The man, who had never once moved since he had taken his station by the graveside, started, raised his head, stared at the person who had addressed him, walked forward for a few paces, and fell down in a swoon. The crazy old woman was too much occupied in bewailing the loss of her cloak, which the undertaker had taken off, to pay him any attention, so they threw a can of cold water over him. And when he came to, saw him safely out of the churchyard, locked the gate, and departed on their different ways. "Well, Oliver," said Sowerberry as they walked home, "how do you like it?" "Pretty well, thank you, sir," replied Oliver, with considerable hesitation. "Not very much, sir." "Ah, you'll get used to it in time, Oliver," said Sowerberry. "Nothing when you are used to it, my boy." Oliver wondered in his own mind whether it had taken a very long time to get Mr. Sowerberry used to it. But he thought it better not to ask the question, and walked back to the shop, thinking over all he had seen and heard. Chapter 6. Oliver, being goaded by the taunts of Noah, rouses into action and rather astonishes him. The month's trial over, Oliver was formally apprenticed. It was a nice sickly season just at this time. In commercial phrase, coffins were looking up, and in the course of a few weeks, Oliver acquired a great deal of experience. The success of Mr. Sowerberry's ingenious speculation exceeded even his most sanguine hopes. The oldest inhabitants recollected no period at which measles had been so prevalent, or so fatal to infant existence, and many were the mournful processions which little Oliver headed, in a hat band reaching down to his knees, to the indescribable admiration and emotion of all the mothers in the town. As Oliver accompanied his master in most of his adult expeditions too, in order that he might acquire the equanimity of demeanor and full command of nerve which was essential to a finished undertaker, he had many opportunities of observing the beautiful resignation and fortitude with which some strong-minded people bear their trials and losses. For instance, when Sowerberry had an ordeal for the burial of some rich old lady or gentleman, who was surrounded by a great number of nephews and nieces, who had been perfectly inconsolable during the previous illness, and whose grief had been wholly irrepressible, even on the most public occasions, they would be as happy among themselves as need be, quite cheerful and contented, conversing together with as much freedom and gaiety as if nothing whatever had happened to disturb them. Husbands, too, bore the loss of their wives with the most heroic calmness. Wives, again, put on weeds for their husbands, as if, so far from grieving in the garb of sorrow, they had made up their minds to render it as becoming and attractive as possible. It was observable, too, that the ladies and gentlemen who were in passions of anguish during the ceremony of interment recovered almost as soon as they reached home, and became quite composed before the tea-drinking was over. All this was very pleasant and improving to see, and Oliver beheld it with great admiration. And we'll go ahead and stop there for this week. As usual, I want to say thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Please like, comment, and subscribe, as it greatly helps the channel. Light be with you all. Take care and thanks again.